Imagine living your entire life surrounded by other people, with no bedrooms, no locked doors, and no place you could simply call your own. Yet ancient humans still found ways to be alone, create personal space, and protect moments of privacy long before modern homes existed. In this documentary, we'll uncover the archaeological and anthropological clues that reveal how our ancestors balanced community life with one of humanity's oldest needs, the need to sometimes be alone. You're lying in bed. Your partner is next to you. The door is closed. The lights are off. You're alone. For 99% of human history, this moment didn't exist. There were no doors, no walls, no bedrooms, just you, your family, and 20 other people sleeping 5 feet away. So, how did ancient humans have privacy? The short answer is they didn't. The long answer is way more interesting. Let's start with the reality. For roughly 300,000 years, humans lived in small groups of 15 to 50 people. You weren't just related to everyone around you. You were physically next to them all the time. Hunter-gatherer camps had no walls, no separate rooms, no private spaces. You slept in a pile for warmth. You ate together. You sat around the same fire. If you needed to have a conversation, everyone heard it. If you were angry, everyone knew. And if you and your partner wanted time alone, everyone was aware of that too. So, how did couples deal with this? Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found a few consistent patterns. The first strategy is timing. Most intimate moments happened at night when it was dark and people were asleep or pretending to sleep. Darkness provided a kind of psychological privacy even when physical privacy didn't exist. The second strategy is distance. Couples would walk away from camp, not far because leaving the firelight meant danger from predators, but far enough that they weren't directly next to everyone else. 50 feet in the dark is basically invisible. The third strategy, and this one's important, is social protocol. Everyone pretended not to notice. Think about it like this. You're in a small tent with your family on a camping trip. Someone needs to change clothes. You don't stare. You look away. You give them psychological space even though physical space doesn't exist. That's what ancient humans did. They developed social rules around privacy. You don't acknowledge certain things even though you're aware of them. But here's where it gets interesting. Privacy as a concept might not have mattered to them the way it matters to us. Anthropologist Colin Turnbull spent years living with the Mbuti people in Central Africa. He noted that they had no word for privacy, not because they were primitive, but because the idea of needing to be alone was foreign to them. Being alone meant being vulnerable. It meant being separated from the protection of the group. For most of human history, solitude wasn't a luxury. It was a death sentence. Let's talk about the bathroom situation because everyone wonders about this. Ancient humans didn't have toilets. They didn't have outhouses. When you needed to go, you walked away from camp, usually to a designated area downwind. You did your business and came back. Was it private? By modern standards, no. You were visible. But again, social protocol mattered. People didn't follow you. They didn't watch. They gave you the illusion of privacy through intentional ignorance. It's the same way modern humans handle public restrooms. There are other people in the room. You can hear them. They can hear you, but everyone pretends they can't. Now, let's address sleeping. Ancient humans slept in groups, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. At night, temperatures dropped. Predators hunted. Fires needed tending. Sleeping together meant warmth and safety. Archaeological evidence from places like Ohallo II in Israel shows that 23,000 years ago, humans built small shelters barely big enough for a family to lie down in. Everyone was touching. There was no rolling over without bumping into someone, and this continued for tens of thousands of years. Even in medieval Europe, entire families slept in one room, often in one bed. The idea of children having their own bedrooms is shockingly recent. It didn't become common until the 1900s. So, when did privacy actually become a thing? The answer is agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, humans started farming. Farming meant staying in one place. Staying in one place meant building permanent structures, and permanent structures meant walls. For the first time in human history, you could close a door. You could have a room that other people couldn't see into. But even then, privacy was a luxury. Only the wealthy had separate bedrooms. Most people still lived in one-room homes with their entire family. Privacy as a right, as something everyone expects, didn't emerge until the last few hundred years. Here's the part that's hard for modern people to understand. Ancient humans might not have wanted privacy the way we do. Psychologist Erich Fromm argued that the need for privacy is a symptom of individualism. In societies where identity is tied to the group, being alone feels wrong. It feels isolating. For ancient humans, the group was everything. Your survival depended on other people. Your identity was built around your role in the tribe. Being alone wasn't peaceful, it was terrifying. Today, we have the opposite problem. We're so isolated that loneliness is an epidemic. We have all the privacy we want, and we're miserable because of it. So, here's the answer. Ancient humans had privacy through social agreement, not physical separation. They created invisible boundaries using timing, distance, and mutual pretense. They didn't need to be alone because their sense of self was different from ours. And when agriculture gave us walls, we slowly built the world we live in now. A world where you can close a door and be completely alone. Where you can go days without seeing another person. Where privacy is so common that we've forgotten what it cost. For 290,000 years, humans were never alone. Then we invented walls, and we've been lonely ever since. And that final idea is where the story becomes much more complicated. Because privacy was never simply the presence or absence of a wall. A wall can separate bodies, but it cannot automatically create trust, discretion, or emotional space. Long before humans built private rooms, they had already developed another kind of boundary. The understanding that certain moments belong to individuals, even when everyone lived close together. You could step away from the fire. You could lower your voice. You could turn your body away from the group. You could wait until everyone else was distracted or asleep. These were small actions, but together they created something remarkably human, a boundary that existed because other people agreed to respect it. Imagine sitting beside a prehistoric fire as darkness spreads across the landscape. There is no house in the modern sense. There is no hallway separating one sleeping area from another. You can hear people breathing, talking, moving around, and tending the fire. Yet you are not necessarily experiencing the constant psychological exposure we might imagine. Human beings are extraordinarily good at creating invisible rules. We learn when to speak, when to remain silent, where to look, when to leave someone alone, and which subjects should never be discussed openly. Those rules can be just as powerful as physical barriers. This is something we still do today, even in places where physical privacy is limited. On a crowded train, people create tiny invisible worlds around themselves. They look at their phones, stare through the window, put on headphones, or deliberately avoid eye contact. Nobody has built a wall around them, but everyone understands the signal: this person is temporarily unavailable. The physical distance may be only a few inches, yet psychologically, a boundary has appeared. Ancient humans could have relied on similar mechanisms, although the exact details would have varied enormously between different societies and periods. And that variation matters. There was never one single ancient human lifestyle. Humans lived across deserts, forests, grasslands, mountains, islands, and frozen environments. Some communities were highly mobile, others eventually built permanent settlements. Some lived in relatively large groups, while others may have occupied smaller temporary camps. Their ideas about family, intimacy, personal possessions, and acceptable behavior could have been very different from one another. What we can say with greater confidence is that humans have always needed some method of managing social boundaries. Even the smallest group contains individuals with different personalities, relationships, conflicts, desires, and responsibilities. If everyone truly had access to every thought, conversation, movement, and interaction of every other person at every moment, social life would become impossible. Communities therefore need rules about what is shared and what is not, and those rules could be enforced without written laws. A glance could communicate that someone should leave. A change in posture could signal discomfort. A person might simply walk away from a conversation. Another might lower their voice when discussing something sensitive. Children would gradually learn these boundaries by watching adults. Nobody needed to write down a privacy manual. The rules became part of culture. This may be one of the most important differences between privacy in the ancient world and privacy today. Modern privacy is often associated with ownership and physical space. We close a door because the room belongs to us. We lock a phone because the information belongs to us. We draw curtains because we don't want strangers looking inside. We use passwords because we believe certain information should be accessible only to particular people. But social privacy can exist without any of those technologies. A person can keep a secret while living in a crowded shelter. A couple can have an intimate conversation while surrounded by relatives. A teenager can feel embarrassed by something and communicate that embarrassment without having a private bedroom. An elder can possess knowledge that they choose not to share. A hunter can leave camp alone for a short period without abandoning the community entirely. In other words, privacy may have begun not as a room, but as a behavior. And once you think about privacy this way, the archaeological record becomes much more interesting. Archaeologists cannot simply dig into the ground and discover a fossil labeled private moment. Human emotions do not preserve themselves in stone. Instead, researchers have to look at indirect evidence, the size and arrangement of shelters, repeated activity areas, sleeping spaces, entrances, hearths, storage locations, personal ornaments, and the ways objects were distributed within settlements. From these patterns, researchers can begin asking whether certain areas were communal, specialized, restricted, or potentially more personal. But there is a limit to what archaeology can tell us. A small room does not automatically mean a private room. A separate structure does not necessarily mean someone wanted to be alone. An object found beside a skeleton does not automatically reveal exactly how its owner felt about personal possessions. Archaeology gives us clues, not a complete recording of prehistoric thoughts. That uncertainty is important because it prevents us from turning ancient humans into characters in a modern story. We cannot simply assume that because we value privacy in a particular way, our ancestors must have experienced it in exactly the same way. Their social worlds were different, and the meaning of being alone could have been different too. For someone living in a dangerous environment, solitude could have carried genuine risks. A person separated from the group might have been farther from warmth, food, protection, and immediate assistance. But at the same time, humans are not naturally comfortable with permanent social exposure either. We seek connection, yet we also seek moments when attention is directed away from us. That tension appears to be deeply rooted in human social life. You can see it even in children. A child may spend an hour happily playing with others and then suddenly disappear behind a tree, crawl into a corner, or turn away from everyone for a few minutes. They may not be seeking complete isolation. They may simply be regulating how much social attention they are receiving. The need for a little psychological distance can appear long before someone understands the modern concept of a private room. And perhaps that is why the invention of architecture was so transformative. Once humans began constructing permanent settlements, they gained the ability to turn invisible boundaries into physical ones. A doorway could now communicate something that previously required behavior. This space is separate from that space. A wall could block sound. A doorway could control movement. A roof could conceal activity from the outside. A partition could divide one family from another. And eventually, a lock could make that boundary enforceable. That was a profound transformation. The human desire for personal space, whatever form it had previously taken, now had a physical structure to support it. Privacy no longer depended entirely on everyone else agreeing to look away. Architecture could do some of the work. But architecture also created a new possibility that would have been much harder to achieve in a small mobile camp: the possibility of being completely unreachable. You could close the door, and for the first time, the rest of the community could be physically separated from you. That simple invention would eventually transform not only privacy, but family life, relationships, childhood, sexuality, sleep, work, wealth, and even the way humans understood the individual self. And once walls began separating one space from another, privacy became something that could be designed into everyday life. A doorway could tell you where one family's space ended and another person's began. A sleeping area could be arranged away from the main activity of a settlement. A storage corner could be kept away from children. Even when an entire household still lived under the same roof, small differences in space could create different degrees of access and separation. Privacy was no longer an all-or-nothing condition. It became a spectrum. This is important because the earliest permanent settlements were not suddenly filled with modern-style private bedrooms. In many cases, several generations could still live together in relatively small structures. Cooking, sleeping, eating, working, and socializing could all happen within the same building. The wall created separation from the outside world, but it did not necessarily separate every individual inside the household. A family might have gained privacy from neighbors while still having very little privacy from one another. And that pattern continued for thousands of years. Even as settlements became villages, towns, and eventually cities, personal space remained closely connected to wealth and social status. A wealthy household could afford additional rooms, servants' quarters, enclosed courtyards, storage areas, and eventually private sleeping spaces. A poorer family might have had only one room where almost every activity took place. The ability to physically separate yourself from other people required resources, land, building materials, labor, and security. In that sense, privacy became partly an economic privilege. The more space you could afford, the more easily you could control who entered it. A powerful person could retreat behind multiple doors, into a courtyard or upper room, while an ordinary laborer might spend most of the day surrounded by co-workers, relatives, neighbors, or other members of the household. The history of privacy is therefore also a history of architecture and inequality. The question was not simply whether humans wanted privacy, it was whether they had the resources to build it. But there was another transformation happening at the same time. As communities became larger, humans developed increasingly complex ideas about what belonged to the public and what belonged to the household. Certain activities became associated with particular spaces. Cooking might happen in one area, religious rituals in another, craft production somewhere else. Sleeping could become separated from other household activities. Gradually, the physical organization of buildings began reinforcing social expectations. And once those expectations became normal, people could begin to feel that certain spaces were supposed to be private. This is a subtle but powerful change. A person raised in a world where every family member sleeps in one room may not experience the absence of a private bedroom as a problem. But someone raised in a culture where every person is expected to have a personal room may experience the opposite situation as deeply uncomfortable. The physical environment doesn't just respond to cultural expectations, it teaches them. A child who grows up with a bedroom learns that there is a place where they can close a door. They learn that knocking before entering is polite. They learn that some possessions belong only to them. They learn that conversations can happen away from everyone else. Eventually, these physical arrangements become psychological expectations. And that helps explain why modern humans can find the idea of ancient communal sleeping so difficult to imagine. We have become accustomed to doors. We close them when we sleep. We close them when we shower. We close them when we work. We close them when we want to think. We even close digital doors by turning off notifications, blocking accounts, and putting our phones on private settings. The boundary has simply changed form. For ancient humans, the boundary might have been a few steps beyond the fire. For a later household, it might have been a doorway. For a modern person, it can be an entire apartment. And now, increasingly, it can exist inside a device that fits into the palm of your hand. The irony is that technology has given us more opportunities for physical privacy than almost any humans who lived before us, while simultaneously creating new forms of exposure. Ancient humans could not be photographed secretly from hundreds of kilometers away. They did not have social media profiles documenting their relationships. They did not carry devices capable of recording their location every minute of the day. Their privacy problems were mostly physical and social. Ours can be physical, social, and digital at the same time. That contrast reveals something important about the human need for boundaries. Technology changes the shape of privacy, but it doesn't eliminate the underlying desire for control over who can see us, hear us, approach us, or know something about us. And perhaps that is why the ancient question still matters. How did humans create privacy without walls? They created it the same way humans have created countless invisible institutions throughout history, through shared expectations. They learned when to approach, when to step back, when to speak, and when silence was more respectful than curiosity. Physical walls eventually strengthened those boundaries, but the social instinct came first. The wall was an invention, the boundary was already human. And once we understand privacy as a social boundary rather than simply a physical wall, another fascinating possibility appears. Privacy may have existed in degrees long before anyone could build a private room. A person could be physically surrounded by dozens of others and still have moments when nobody expected them to speak, explain themselves, or participate. Sitting quietly at the edge of a camp, walking a short distance to collect water, working alone on a tool, or simply turning away from the group could provide a temporary form of psychological distance. It wasn't solitude in the modern sense, but it may have served some of the same human needs. The same principle could have applied to conversation. In a small community, everyone might know one another, but that doesn't mean everyone knew everything about everyone else. Information could still be controlled. A person could choose whom to tell a story to, whom to trust with a secret, or which subjects were appropriate for a particular audience. Human beings have always been capable of creating layers of communication. One conversation could happen publicly around the fire, while another happened quietly between two people after the others had gone to sleep. This becomes especially important when we consider conflict. Imagine living in a group where you cannot simply disappear into another room after an argument. You still have to negotiate. You may need to lower your voice, walk away temporarily, or rely on another person to mediate. In small communities, social relationships were not disposable. You couldn't simply block someone and never see them again. The person you argued with might still be the person you depended on for food, protection, childcare, or knowledge the next morning. That reality may have encouraged forms of emotional regulation that modern people sometimes overlook. Maintaining harmony wasn't just about being polite. It could be practical survival. A community that constantly fractured into hostile individuals would have difficulty coordinating hunts, protecting children, responding to danger, and sharing resources. Social boundaries, therefore, had to coexist with cooperation, and this is where privacy becomes connected to trust. The ability to give someone space depends on believing that they will return to the group and remain part of it. If someone walks away from the fire, nobody needs to follow them because the group understands that temporary separation doesn't mean abandonment. In a sense, privacy works best when people feel secure enough to allow one another to disappear for a little while. That may be one reason why the modern experience of privacy can feel so different. We have made physical separation incredibly easy, but physical separation doesn't automatically create emotional security. A person can live alone in an apartment, close the door, and still feel completely exposed, watched, or lonely. Another person can live in a crowded household and still feel deeply connected and emotionally safe. The ancient world reminds us that these are different things. Privacy is about control over access, solitude is about being physically alone, and loneliness is about feeling disconnected. They can overlap, but they are not the same. Our ancestors may have had very little physical solitude while possessing strong social connection. Modern humans can have enormous physical privacy while experiencing profound isolation. That difference may explain why the invention of walls did not solve every human problem. Walls can keep people out, but they cannot decide who we actually want to let in. And as settlements expanded, this tension became increasingly visible. The larger the community became, the more important rules about access became. Who could enter a house? Who could enter a courtyard? Who could approach a ruler? Who could see sacred objects? Who could hear private conversations? Who could sleep in which area? These questions eventually became part of law, religion, architecture, and social status. Privacy was no longer just something negotiated between individuals beside a fire, it became something societies could regulate. And that transformation would eventually lead to a world where privacy could be treated almost like a possession, something that could be protected by doors, walls, property rights, customs, and eventually laws. But that world was still thousands of years away. For most of human existence, the first line of defense was much simpler. It was another person's willingness to look away. So, how did ancient humans get privacy without walls? The answer is more fascinating than simply saying they didn't have it. They created privacy through behavior before they created it through architecture. They used darkness, distance, timing, silence, social rules, and mutual understanding. A person could step away from the fire, lower their voice, turn their body away, or simply trust others not to interfere. These invisible boundaries may have been the earliest form of privacy. Later, when humans settled down and began building permanent homes, those invisible boundaries became physical. Walls, rooms, doors, and eventually locks gave people something their ancestors rarely had: the ability to control access to their personal space. But history reveals an important paradox. More privacy did not necessarily mean more happiness. Ancient humans may have had very little solitude, but they lived within dense networks of family and community. Modern humans can close a door and disappear completely from the world, yet still feel profoundly lonely. That distinction matters. Privacy is not the same as isolation. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. And being surrounded by people is not necessarily the same as having no personal boundaries. Perhaps the most important lesson from our ancestors is that humans have always needed both connection and distance. We need people who will stand beside us, and moments when they know to step back. The wall came later. The boundary came first. And maybe that is the real story of human privacy. We didn't invent the need for personal space when we invented houses. We built houses because that need was already inside us. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans learned to create invisible spaces between one another. Eventually, we simply learned how to build them out of stone and wood.